So we are really, really excited that we are able to do this today. Julian asked why we're doing it like this instead of the standard Zoom. And the reason is that we weren't sure how many attendees were going to show up, and we wanted to be able to have all the panelists on screen and then everybody else able to ask questions. So the way we're going to do this is after Ahmed and I say a little bit about the initiative and what we're trying to do, then we're going to do the series of sessions. Each one, we are asking the speakers to speak for approximately 7 minutes or so. And then that will leave 15 minutes for questions in each session. We are going to try and, Tessa, are you going to handle the calling on people? Is that how this is going to work? Like allowing...
I can. That works.
Okay. So if you would like to ask a question, you should raise your hand like Mariam has done. Now she hasn't, but you should raise your hand with a little the wavy hand thing in the thing, or you can send the chat/Q&A as Mariam just did. And we will take it from there. So let me let Ahmed, since this was his idea at the start, why don't we have Ahmed say a few words of welcome on behalf of the American Political Science Association.
Well, thank you, Mark, and I really appreciate it for the section taking on this opportunity. I think this started as a conversation with some of the alumni from the APSA-MENA workshops who were interested in finding more about some of the questions and getting answers for some of the questions that they have as they embark on more research and other opportunities, especially in a tough situation as we're all going through. The fact that we're doing this on Zoom as opposed to being in San Francisco in person just shows how different this could have been. Just quickly, for some of you who might not know about the Middle East North Africa program at APSA, I mean, some of you already know that, but this program started in 2013 as a sister program to an Africa workshops program that has been at APSA for 8 years. This has been ongoing since 2013. It involves annual thematic workshops. It involves some alumni support in terms of research grants. It involves other scholarly opportunities, whether it's IQMR and ICPSR, the qualitative and quantitative schools training in the United States, and other opportunities that I'm happy to chat further if anyone wants to in the Q&A, or if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to also share my email in the chat box. Additionally, our alumni has been growing, and I think we have over 140, 150 alumni that goes up to 170, including the leaders who have led the workshops over the past 7 years. We look forward to continuing this, and we're excited that the MENA section started in 2018. Mark and the team of executives on the board has been slowly developing exciting opportunities, from the newsletter to others that I'm sure Mark will talk about. But just to finish this simply, we look forward to collaborating and working with colleagues in the region and also institutions in the Middle East, North Africa. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And thank you, Mark, and thank you, Lizel, Gillian, Sean, May, and Liz for supporting this professional development opportunity.
Thank you, Ahmed. So I would like to build on that a little bit. Ahmed and Andrew Stinson have been, and Betsy Super have been untiring in trying to make the American Political Science Association work for scholars of the Middle East and scholars in the Middle East. And we have been collaborating with them on multiple things over the last few years. We, in this context, means two different organizations, which I'm currently leading. The Project on Middle East Political Science, which is an independent network of scholars working on the Middle East, and then the MENA Politics section, which was established by the APSA last year, or 2 years ago now at this point. And so both of those have multiple opportunities that we very much hope that you will take advantage of and pay attention to. Perna will put links up in the chat of the POMEPS website and various other things as we talk about them. But I would draw your attention to a couple in particular. Since the summer when COVID hit and took away so many opportunities for research workshops, POMEPS and the APSA-MENA section together launched a virtual research workshop in which we bring together 3 or 4 junior scholars to workshop full papers, like journal article type papers, and with senior scholar discussants. And we did 5 of those over the summer. We're doing 4 of them at least this fall. We're planning to do another 4 or 5 in the spring, and we'll put out a call for papers and a call for proposals. Perna will can get you information on how to apply for those. We also, through the MENA Politics section, I edit the newsletter, which, at least for the next year, which features short articles on topics of relevance to the field of MENA politics. And we very much encourage you to be involved with those. And then through POMEPS, we do a number of thematic workshops, which become collections of in our POMEPS studies series. And we always put out a call for proposals on those. And we are very, very keen on making sure that we are finding scholars outside of our networks, and especially junior scholars from the region, who can participate in those and contribute to the work that we do. So I'm not going to belabor the point so much in terms of all the things that we do, other than to say that these are all opportunities which we are highly committed to opening up to scholars from the region, to scholars who have not previously had the opportunity to participate in either APSA or POMEPS activities, or scholars working in and around parts of the Middle East which are not well represented in current programming, which includes Turkey, Israel, Iran, and parts of North Africa, such as the Sudan, which have traditionally been somewhat marginalized in Middle East studies. And so, at this, I'm going to begin the proceedings of this professional development workshop. And I really do want to emphasize that this workshop is for you. And we are very much going to try to do our very best to leave enough time for you to ask your questions and to give brief but hopefully useful answers. The first session will be myself and Jillian Schwedler from Hunter College. Jillian will talk about developing a publication agenda, and I'll talk about how to go about turning your dissertation into a book. And then we'll be followed by Liesl Hintz talking about postdoctoral fellowships, Liz Nugent talking about navigating the job market, May Darwish talking about the UK and European job markets, and finally Sean Yom talking about consulting and non-academic publishing opportunities and how they relate to your professional career. So why don't we, at this point, turn it over to Jillian Schwedler, and she'll speak for 6 or 7 minutes, and then I'll speak for 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll take the questions together at the end of our little mini section. Jillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Ahmed, for this fantastic initiative as well. What I want to talk about was something that no one talked to me about, that I think is really important, which is to think about your publication agenda or your publication portfolio. So we all know it's important to get publications, either to get the job or to get promoted. And you have basically one really big project, which is your dissertation, your first book. But you need to put some thought into what you're going to do with that. So a mistake is often like, I got to get an article out. Here's an article, I send it out here. And then you get a first article, and then you want another article. And before you know it, you've published a lot of the big interventions from your dissertation, which means publishers aren't actually going to be interested in your dissertation if too much of it's been published. So as a general rule of thumb, you can publish 2 chapters from what the book project will be. You can use the same empirical material to do something entirely different, that's fine, but don't give away too much of your book manuscript, or you will not find a publisher that's able to do it. Another way to think about what those articles are going to look like is not just to, send off here and there whatever seems to be most advanced, like, oh, chapter 4 is pretty far along, so I'll just spin that into an article. I think it's worth thinking of what you want your portfolio to look like. So if you're already in a faculty position, find out, talk to your chair about what they're looking for. Are they looking for only really high impact journals? Are they looking for volume of publication? Are they looking for diversity, et cetera? And look at people that had been tenured there recently, what their portfolios look like. If you're not in a faculty position anyways, and if you are, it's still worthwhile thinking about, am I going to go for the one really big hit, the, APSR, JOP, perspectives kind of thing? Really thick description where you can get all the empirical detail in there, IJMIS or something like that. Is there a thematic journal? So if you're working in protests and social movements, you want to have a piece in social movement studies or mobile, one of those journals. So it's worth thinking, what do I want that portfolio to look like, so that you don't give away to that, more area specific journal something that's actually a big intervention that might actually have a chance at perspectives on politics, right? Because the smaller journals are going to see it and go, oh my God, yes, but that might have been the one that's most likely to get into the big one. So you want to think, if you want to get that big one, think through, what is my big intervention, the big idea first, and then you use your empirics for that. But just think that through, because you could back yourself into a corner in the rush to get a publication. You might put something and place it somewhere that precludes placing it somewhere else that might have actually been a good fit. So think about that balance, I think, is really important. I think it's also, and maybe Sean will touch on this later, but I think it's important to think through the labor that goes into these different publications. So if you're doing an APSR one, it might be slow and several revisions, but it's probably going to be worthwhile for you professionally to get that one. But you want to think through, okay, do I want to get that one out the door? And while that's out the door, then I'm going to work on my manuscript or a smaller journal. Or if I just defended, I really am not in the mental space to begin revising my manuscript into a book just yet. Usually the first year is not a good time because you're still in defense mode. Article that you never finish to kind of direct your attention elsewhere. So thinking through how these pieces fit is important. And the thing I mentioned, Sean, he's saying, I'm not going to talk about APSR. The thing he might be talking about is there are the sort of non-referee journal outlets that sometimes can be very valuable. So either, a merit piece or Journal of Democracy, something that's not a referee journal, but that might have, 10,000, 15,000 people read it. That can do a lot in building your name. So, people be like, oh, so-and-so Jillian works on protests, or, and so you can, sometimes it might be worthwhile for a high profile to invest a little bit of time in a piece that's going to get you attention. So just thinking through, how am I going to take the work that I have and the theoretical interventions I have, how am I going to break them up in a publication agenda? What am I going to go for first? What am I going to prioritize? And what do I want that to look like? If I'm in a department, what are they looking for, right? They might prefer, 2 APSR articles than, 8 referee articles in a range of journals, or they might prefer diversity. So find that out. I think that's good. But I think, thinking that out ahead of time, which I didn't do, I just said, oh, I'll send this here, I'll send this here. And the next thing I know, it's like, oh, that one that did come out quickly, I could have spent more time with and probably placed it at a different journal. But that didn't even occur to me to think through that strategy. It was just like, what's next? I did that. Okay, now what's the next thing? And that was not a good strategy. So I think I'll stop there, because that's, I think, like 6 or 7 minutes.
Okay, super. Thank you, Jillian. And that actually, some of your comments feed into what I wanted to talk about in terms of turning your dissertation into a book. And so I'm the editor of a series at Columbia University Press, and so I've seen a ton of proposals over the last 5 or 6 years. And so I just wanted to kind of say a few things about how you should go about going from dissertation to book, which is one of the most important things that you'll do in your career. And you might have heard some of this stuff before, but it never hurts to hear it again. So the first thing to keep in mind is that a book is not a dissertation. It's written for a very specific audience, your advisors, and the outside readers who are going to sign off on your dissertation. And there are things that we expect from a dissertation, such as lengthy literature reviews, sharply defined claims, kind of long discussions of methodology. And those are things which are necessary often for a successful dissertation, but they are often not what is necessary for a successful book, which is a different project. A book that you write should be like the books that you like to read. It should make a compelling argument. It should make a unique contribution, and it doesn't need to do as much of the hand waving and showing your work that the dissertation does. Almost everybody is going to tell you correctly that the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get rid of the literature review. And you are going to get rid of the literature review. But that's not exactly what you're going to do. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to tell a story through the literature about how the work you are doing is important and unique, and you're going to be sure to cite and to reference the key books and articles in that field so that you can show where you fit into a larger conversation. Your book is an intervention into some larger conversation, and that's how you need to be thinking about it. You're writing for a larger public now. If they're buying the book, they already know you're an expert. You're not proving it to them the way you are to your advisor, and they want to see what have you got. And that means getting rid of a lot of the things that you had to do in the dissertation. And I can talk more about that if you like, but I want to move on to the next step, which is that, when Jillian is talking about going for the APSR or perspectives, something similar happens with books, but in a different way. So, there is like the Pareto optimal strategy apparently is just everybody goes to Cambridge. And I'm not sure why, because Cambridge is a wonderful press, but actually you will be much better off if you do your homework in terms of studying the types of books that a press puts out. Because a Cornell book is very, very different from a Cambridge book, which is very, very different from a Stanford book. And so if you have a really, really great kind of ethnographic look at street politics in Cairo, that might not even get a second look at one press, and it might be a slam dunk at another press. And that says nothing about the quality of the book or the quality of the press. It simply means that different presses specialize in different things. And you can waste a lot of your time in your life at a time in your career where you don't have time to waste by going to the wrong press. How do you know if you're going to the right press? Talk to the editors, talk to the series editors, who are probably easier to talk to as well. Ordinarily, we would be doing this at the APSA, but there is no more, nobody goes anywhere anymore. There are no conferences. So you have to be more proactive. Reach out over email, talk to the series editors of the series that you like. Don't worry about bothering the editors of university presses. It is their job to be bothered, and have a conversation with them. And if they seem interested, that's great. It doesn't mean they're going to publish it, but at least they're interested enough for you to send your prospectus. Number 3, write your prospectus. Spend a lot of time writing your prospectus, because that is what the editor is going to read. That's what the publication committee is going to read. And that has to be your best case for your work. You have 3 or 4 pages to state very, very clearly what is your contribution, what is your expertise, what is your data, and why would people read this book. Part of your prospectus will be a market analysis. In that market analysis, you will be asked to say what are the competing texts in the field. Do not pretend that there are no competing texts, because that will tell the editor that you don't know what you're talking about, and therefore you're probably not an expert. Don't just list every other book that's ever been published on your topic. Think very carefully. If someone is putting together a graduate seminar on this topic in the year 2021, what books are they likely to put on that syllabus? Or if you're aiming at an undergraduate market, what books are they likely to put on the syllabus? That's what the editors want to know. Spend your time going to break thing. A lot of people throw these together at the last minute, and that's a bad idea. If you are not sure what goes into the prospectus, then that probably says you're not sure what the book is about yet. And so if you can't put together a compelling prospectus, then don't send it out and don't try and pitch your book because you're not ready yet. You need to have that 3 or 4 page summary of what you're doing. Next point. Once you've gotten interest from the press, don't expect to get an advance contract based on your prospectus, because most presses will not, just give a contract to a first-time author based on a prospectus. They want to see, at least I as an editor, I want to read a whole book. You can tell me that you've written the definitive study of street politics in Cairo. Great, my dog can tell me that. I want to see it. I want to read it, and I want to decide if it's good before I decide that I'm going to send it out to the reviewers and take their time to do it. So make sure your book is ready to go. And if you have a good conversation with an editor and they like your prospectus, but your book's not ready to go, they will wait. There is no clock on this. I shouldn't say this, but I have a contract with a major university press, which is now 12 years old, and I haven't written a word of the book. That's a bad thing to happen. Do not emulate this. But at the same time, if they're interested in your book now, they'll be interested in 8 months when it's really good. There's a lot of other things, but I don't want to monopolize this. I just want to say one last thing because it's really, really, really important for you in a junior position where you are, most of you, I presume, are now. You are going to be doing significant revisions to your dissertation, but do not write a second book. In other words, make the dissertation into the best book that it can be, but don't get really excited by some new idea and end up writing an entire second book, which by the time you're done, you're so far past the tenure clock that you're going to be in serious trouble. There'll be plenty of time in your career to write your second book, and I would write that second book after you've published the first book. With that, I would like to stop and open it up to questions to either Jillian or myself. Let's see. So Perna, Tessa, how are we doing this?
So if someone has a question, they can just go ahead and raise their hand. And it looks like Dina has a question, so.
Okay, Dina, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Hi again. I have 2 questions here. The first one has to do with the readability of the first book or the manuscript. Would you prefer that I go ahead and publish it online for a wider audience, for a faster publication and for readability, or to hold on to it and publish it in the traditional way? That's the first question. The second question has to do with academia, like the online. That many of my friends, they publish, and I'm asking in 2 ways. First of all, the ethical part, I mean like plagiarism, that they publish their paper somewhere. That's about articles. They publish their paper somewhere and they publish it in academia. And I get like about my own papers, like someone hit someone, like you have been mentioned in a paper by an important author in academia, stuff like that. How important is that in my career? That's my second question. Thank you very much.
Jillian, why don't I go first? We can go in order. On the first question, I would say that you definitely want to try and publish with a regular press with your first book. I mean, you've put 6 years of your life probably into a dissertation. This is your major intellectual statement, and I think that you're better off getting a quality publication than a fast publication there. Now, again, it depends also on what your career goals are, but I would say that if you're trying to pursue an academic job, then you want, to the best of your ability, to get that dissertation published with a university press or with a high quality trade press. And that's, I think, a pretty high priority, I think, for a career trajectory. Jillian, did you want to say something about the second question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question because unless it's an open source journal, you're not allowed to post your material publicly. It's a violation of the agreement with the publisher. Some of them have timelines, etc. But most people post their stuff on Academia or ResearchGate to make it available. And publishers, I mean, I've had publishers tell me as a crowd, they're not chasing people down to prosecute you for posting your own material online. So it's tricky because, it's technically a violation, it's technically unethical, but I think it's a minor thing. I do it. I'm on Academia. I'm also on ResearchGate, but I don't post my stuff there. I only post the stuff on Academia. And I find it gets, you know, a lot of visibility. I think my citations have skyrocketed since I started doing that a few years ago, because it does, your work does show up in searches that other people make. I do think it's, you know, helpful for visibility.
And visibility really does matter, because when I'm looking at a pile of 125 job files, if I see a name that I recognize because via Google Scholar, I found an interesting paper and I downloaded it, that's not the same as maybe, you know, your H-index on or whatever, but it matters. It really does.
So I see there's a question here in the box.
Sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat. I was about to let Teresa speak. Let me look at the.
So this one's about, does it matter from a career standpoint where you publish in terms of prestige? It depends on the department. It really does. I mean, obviously the higher prestige, bigger impact, the better. That's also going to take longer time usually to get those done, because the review processes can be slower. They'll often send out for more than 2 reviews, and they very often have a long queue for it to come out. More and more are doing the immediate publish as soon as it's accepted online, and then it gets filed into an actual issue later. I think, you know, a good middle ground is a balance. You really do want to have at least one big hit top journal to show that you can play with the big kids. But if your department values, you know, they want to see like 8 to 10 referee articles in a 6-year period, you're not going to have 8 to 10 APR JOP articles, right? So you need to think through. That's why I said thinking through the sort of the you know, do you want the empirical, the area studies journal one, or the thematic topic of your research? If it's, you know, migration or conflict, you want that one and a big hit one. I think the balance of them is a good way to go. But again, if you're in a department, get as clear advice as possible from the people that will be determining that. And a piece of advice that was given to me is, when you talk to people in your department and they say, oh yeah, this is what you need, send them an email and thank you for having that conversation, and write down what was said, because it can matter down the road if somebody said like, oh no, you don't need to have a second book project. And then 3 years later, they're like, where's the second book project? And you're like, my chair told me I didn't have to have a second book project. They wanted, you know, a book and 8 articles, and that's what I did. So it's not a bad idea when you're told what you need to make sure you have it in writing. And if they haven't written it to you, you can write it to them and say, thank you for telling me. I just want to be clear. Is this what you said? So that's a good kind of separate piece of advice.
On that, I would advise that don't write to your own institution's tenure standards. Write to the top or the modal top institution's tenure standards, because that gives you a bigger cushion. Let me answer a few quick questions from the chat, and then we'll go to Teresa. On the question of simultaneous submissions acceptable at university presses, it can be done, and it depends on the press, but it is typically frowned upon. And if you do it, you should be very, very transparent about what you are doing. Make sure that you have the approval and the understanding of both editors. I have seen people get in significant trouble by trying to hedge their bets and submitting to 2 presses simultaneously, and then pulling it from one press in favor of the other. This is a very bad idea in long-term career terms. I think the major exception is if you're up for tenure on a short clock and you talk to both of the presses and say, look, I have to get this book published in the next year, and they both say, yes, you can do that, then you do it. But as a matter of principle, I tend to say, no, don't do simultaneous submissions on to university presses. On the question, Maro's question about 3-article dissertation, and how much of that could you use for the book, that's a tricky one. More and more departments are pushing for that kind of dissertation. And it works in American politics in a way that it doesn't work as well in our field. Because in American politics, you can do the article strategy and have a very good shot at tenure. In our field, traditionally, we still expect to see a book. And I think that, you know, some norms are changing. And, you know, if you can take your 3-article dissertation and land those articles in the APSR, the JOP, and, you know, the perspectives on politics, you're going to do pretty well. but you can't then use that for a book. You know, no one's going to want to publish a book in which all 3 articles have already been published. So it's tricky because this is a trend in the field, and I think that we need to kind of, as a field, think about it more. Matthew, you asked if there's a value in contacting editors prior to having a prospectus. Yes, the answer is absolutely 100% yes. Talk about your idea, see if they're enthusiastic, and then, you know, when you do have a prospectus and you email them, they already know you, they've already talked to you, and so absolutely, you should begin the conversation with as many editors as you can, with presses you've already investigated, that they publish the type of book you do, and I would absolutely 100% recommend that.
And I add to that is, like, if you start that conversation can continue. So if you've talked to them a couple times and then you finally give them the manuscript and the prospectus, they already kind of know who you are. They're a little bit invested if they still want to see it. If you just send the prospectus, it's a yes or no and you're done. Right? Yeah. So get all the information you can ahead of time. And to echo something Mark said before, and this is true, I found it to be true as well, is if you say, I'll definitely have the manuscript to you by December, and December's coming around and it's not where you want it to be, proactively send them a message and say, I have some more work to get it really where I want it to be. It's going to be June. They're not going to say no, but don't send them something that's not where you want it to be. You know,
they'll get one shot at it.
Yeah. They'll appreciate that you've let them know, because basically it's like we just disappear and hope nobody notices. So don't be that person. Let them know. Say, you know, to be as strong as it could be, I'm going to need another 6 months. It's just stuff come up. It happens all the time. It's not going to matter, but send it when it's ready.
Let's let Teresa ask her question, and then we'll go to the questions from Nasser and Emily.
Thank you so much for organizing it. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. So just a quick question. Do you have any tips for not, you know, talking with the editors or putting together the prospectus, because that's what I've already done, and I'm in the middle of revising my manuscript for a book. If there is anything you can think about it as a recommendation. And the second question is, because I'm past the stage of thinking about publication, well, hopefully not really, but the book is not out yet, of course, but the articles are on the way as well as the book, hopefully. And I'm thinking about the agenda of the step after. So do you have any recommendations of where to start once you finish your first book, and how to look for new research avenues and projects? Thank you.
On the writing process, I would simply say that I've found it to be quite productive for people at the right stage to have a book workshop where they have kind of senior scholars, or at least published authors, read the manuscript and give you the kind of feedback, because that's when you'll get like detailed advice on your project from the perspective of someone who's been through this before. It's very hard for me to give general abstract advice because everyone is different. Some people have different writing styles and that sort of thing. But I would say that the book workshop is very useful. I would not recommend multiple book workshops, because you'll start getting conflicting advice and you'll get diminishing returns. A single book workshop to give you a clear set of kind of guidance is really very good at kind of when you have a manuscript that you think is, you know, ready for that. Jillian?
So on approaching publishers and editors, I think for me, and that Mark said, this is the transition from the dissertation where you're really arguing, nobody's looked at this before. Don't ever say no one's looked at this before to an editor, because again, someone's looked at it before, and if you just haven't figured out who, then you haven't done your homework. That doesn't mean you don't have something to contribute, but you don't want to lead with like methodology, like this is my dependent variable. And the editors don't want to hear that shit. They don't care. What they want to hear is two things. One, substantively what you're doing, and two, what empirical work are you doing it with, right? So it can't just be like, I'm looking at protests in Jordan for the last century. Why? Who cares? So no one's done that in a book, but so what? No, you need to say, I'm arguing that protests are affecting state-making processes consistently, and not only in moments of crisis. And I'm doing that through a deep look of original ethnographic work, drawing on Jordan and the historical archives, right? So there's what's the big intervention that's not just about your case, And then what are you doing with your case that's also new, that you're bringing new empirical material to? So I would say, like, you got to hit those two with the publisher, because they're not just going to want to say nobody's seen a book on protests in Jordan, because, like, who cares? Maybe there's a good reason no one's written a book on protests in Jordan, right?
Some topics are justifiably ignored.
Yeah, but I would say, like, hit those two poles. Don't lead with methodology, just lead with the substance. And then you can say, I'm using this method or that method to get there, but don't lead with methods. The books, they don't care about methods. They want to know big intervention, original empirics to do it with.
So I'm going to answer a couple questions from chat. Question. So Emily Scott asked about the second book, and I want to clarify what I said. You do want to write a second book. What I meant is, don't write a second book before you publish the first book. In other words, don't like kind of leave your dissertation behind and on the cutting room floor while you go in pursuit of a second project. So finish your first project before you switch over to the second project. And in terms of what you want when you're in a postdoc early tenure track job, this gets back to what Jillian was saying before, and I guess what I was saying is that you have to have your publication agenda aimed towards what's going to get you tenure. Most kind of research universities, and frankly, I got tenure at a liberal arts college, and it was pretty much the same. They expect to see a published book, significant progress towards a second project of some kind, along with, at Williams, it was like 6 articles. Probably at R1 universities, it's probably more like 6 to 10 articles. And that's what you need to be working towards, is having a tenurable file. The more stuff that you can get done in your early postdoc period before you start teaching, the better. Lisa, I'm sure we'll talk about that, because you should assume that your first year or two when you're teaching is going to be just super fun, and it's not going to be hard at all, right, Liz? Yeah, no, teaching is going to take up a lot of your time. The more that you can get started on those projects during a postdoc year, the better off you'll be. And then Nasser's question about how well connected the publications are, that's a tricky question, and Jillian can answer it also. My sense is that it's okay if you have, so for example, suppose you did a comparative study of Egypt and Tunisia in your dissertation, but it was much more Egypt heavy than Tunisia heavy, and you decide the book is going to be about Egypt, and then you publish a standalone article about Tunisia, which is in the same theoretical type of thing. That's great. People like to see that. Or suppose that you wrote this really great paper on dependency theory in grad school, and you publish that in a good peer-reviewed journal, and that has nothing to do with your book. That's also fine. I think what you don't want is to spread out a lot of articles on unrelated journals so that nobody really knows what your core contribution is. I think that you basically, I mean, this is like, I guess, this is why it's called this. You need a job talk paper. You need a job talk paper which is the best presentation of your dissertation research. And then it's good if you have other things, but you need to have that signature contribution, or else people aren't going to be able to put you into a box and know kind of what you really do. One of the things that happens when you go up for tenure is they try and find people who are major scholars in your field. If you have 10 papers on 10 different topics, we're not really going to know who are the right people in your field. And also, those people might not know who you are because they've only seen one paper on that topic from you. So you do need to have something which is your core of who you are as a scholar. And then if you have other things that land in good places, that's great. I mean, you do want to see that.
And I would, just add to that slightly, and think of in terms of having a research agenda. So it's sort of like, I'm interested in protests and geography in Jordan, and I just wrote that book, and I'm like, oh, it's done, right? No, rather you want to say, like, that's a piece of my real research agenda, has to do with contentious politics, and I'm increasingly interested in geography. So you can see a kind of trajectory. My next project will be different, but it's somehow connected to that. So they want to see, for job talks and also for promotion, that you have a research agenda, that you have a research trajectory, that you're not a one-trick pony. You wrote a great book and you don't know where it's going. So when they ask you, like, what's next, or when you write your tenure file where you're describing your research agenda, you situate it. I was broadly interested in contentious politics and these kinds of questions. out of this came my book project. You know, this is my signature piece. I'm thinking, looking in the future, maybe not contentious politics, but taking my interest in geography in these kinds of ways. You know, something they want to see you thinking and thinking ahead and moving, right? And so all those pieces along the way can take you there. And if a article's somewhat different, that's fine. They might want to say, so why did you write this, you know, article on, you know, Washington, D.C.? And then you have an answer like, oh, well, I was collaborating with somebody and we came up and we did it together. And it's a side project, but it makes sense in terms of, like, you can explain why it's there. They want to see you think in job talks and in their tenure review. They want to see that you're a thinker. So, you know, thinking, what is my research agenda? You know, what are the big questions of which my book and other articles are kind of fit along the way?
So let's let Fouad ask his question, and then we'll go to the second panel.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jillian. It was really useful. Just a quick question about, you know, for junior scholars or PhD students who are actually, you know, finishing their dissertation. I mean, suppose that a dissertation constitutes of something like 2 parts, and each part constitutes of 3 chapters. That means a total of 6 chapters that can stand by themselves as an article or as articles. What would be, you know, a strategic, if I may say this word, strategic move from a junior scholar to do? Would he actually choose to turn this dissertation into a book, or would he actually try to, you know, publish these chapters, you know, these dissertation chapters into articles, work on them a little bit more, and try to, you know, publish them individually in certain jobs? What would be better to do for, especially for a junior scholar? Thank you.
I would say that that it's a safer strategy within the field as kind of in comparative politics, international relations. It's a safer strategy to have the book along with a few good articles. It's hard to get tenure in comparative politics, international relations with just an article strategy. And also, I don't know how related those 6 chapters are, but if they're overly repetitive, then people will see this as, you know, kind of squeezing the orange a little too dry. You know, they don't want to see, you know, kind of 6 variations on the same theme, especially if they're not coming out in top journals. I mean, my advice would be, from what you've described, is to try and have one big hit article, which is your job talk paper, and take the best of the chapters and turn that into a standalone article. I probably wouldn't go more than that. Then you start compromising your chances of getting the book published. But rather than like the 2 chapters that are symmetrical, I would say one of them is like it's got all the good stuff in it, and that's going into world politics. And then another one, which is one of your case studies, going into either an area studies journal or into you know, another disciplinary journal. But I think that the article strategy is pretty risky in our field, at least. At this point, I think we should move to the second panel. Liesl Hintz of SAIS and Liz Nugent of what's that school up in Canada? I don't even know. Just kidding. Liz Nugent at Yale, and they will each again speak for about 7 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions again. And if you have questions coming up, putting them in the chat. That's actually working quite well.
Okay, sounds good. I can go ahead and start. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks to Mark and Ahmed for putting this together and inviting me to speak on postdocs. I'm really excited to speak about this topic. It's something that means a lot to me. I think that the postdoctoral fellowship that I did at Cornell in 2015-16 was really fundamental to the job I eventually landed, to the time I was able to spend getting my first book out, to the network of scholars that I was able to develop. And so I really want to kind of focus on the types of postdocs that there are, strategies for applying, and then what to do once you're there, super briefly. But I just kind of want to address what I think sometimes people think of as this idea that postdocs are kind of a fallback if you don't get a tenure track job. And first of all, some of the competitions for postdocs, you know, if we're talking about the Watson Institute at Brown or Niehaus at Princeton or Belfer Center at Harvard, they're even more, you know, competitive than some of they're really an opportunity for you to develop your research agenda, depending on the commitments that come with the particular postdoc, and I'll talk about that a little bit. The time for you to be able to apply for your, you know, hopefully your tenure track position if you're going in the academic route, but also to really do that work on the book that Mark was talking about. I actually chose my postdoc over a tenure track position when I was coming out of my PhD. Now, I don't advise that for everybody, and if you do that, prepare to have a very long conversation with your department about why you made that decision. But they can really provide a fantastic opportunity. When we think about postdocs, there are sort of more research-based fellowships, there are teaching-based fellowships, there are project-based fellowships. So you really want to be aware of the kinds of commitments that you're going to sort of be walking into and what's going to be expected of you. Is it going to be very teaching heavy? Is it essentially going to sort of be like what my second position was, which was a visiting assistant professor position at Barnard, where it was, you know, 6 new preps? Or is it research-based, where you just have the time to develop your research agenda? Are you going to be contributing to a collaborative project? So really kind of suss out the nature of the postdoc and the kinds of expectations that are going to be put on you. Also thinking about the length of the postdoc. Now this, of course, is assuming that you could get all the postdocs that you're applying for, and that's not how it works. But when you're thinking about the advantages that postdocs can bring, a 1-year postdoc, which is what I had, is a tremendous opportunity, but you're basically going to spend the first 2 months there applying for your next position and sort of scrambling to try and find where you're going to go next. 2-year postdocs, 3-year postdocs give you that kind of luxurious cushion of being able to spend your time there really, again, working on the book, getting your research agenda centered. When we're thinking about applying for different postdocs, and you know, it's going to be similar to, in terms of searching out postdocs, it'll be similar to probably what Liz is going to talk about in a second. You know, you're looking at APSA e-jobs, you're looking at Inside Higher Ed, all that stuff. But what you want to think about is, I mean, ideally, who you want to work with. Where do your research interests best fit? If you think about the community of scholars that you're going to be working with, you may, for example, have a mentor. I was paired with Peter Katzenstein at Cornell, and that mentorship, obviously you have your mentorship with your dissertation advisor and your committee, but in the postdoc, you can also think, depending on the configuration of faculty members you're associated with, of that as a mentorship opportunity as well. Someone who can write you letters of recommendation, someone who can write a blurb on your book cover, right? So you can think about that as a way to develop that sort of network of scholars as well. When you're thinking about applying, you want to be flexible in terms of the research proposal that you're putting together. Research proposals are tricky, you know, because you obviously are probably going to talk about how you're going to turn the dissertation into a book, but you also want to sort of talk about what you're doing beyond that. And one of the things that the committee that's reviewing your application is going to want to know is, how does what your research agenda is advancing fit with their interests? Whether it's, you know, like a regional based fellowship or a thematic-based fellowship, whether it's CSAC at Stanford, or maybe Middle East Studies, the Belfer Center, or Security Studies. You know, you're going to want to be able to show in the purview and the research interests of the center or the position that you're applying for. To particular funding streams as well. So you want to be flexible. You know, I work on Turkey, so I was applying for both, you know, European studies focused fellowships as well as Middle East studies focused fellowships. And there's an extent to which you can shape your project or your proposal without stretching it too far that it goes beyond the bounds of that actually doesn't fit here. But really kind of trying to tailor it to the extent that you can speak to the research interests of the position that you're applying for. You also, in addition to having your research proposal be flexible, you also want it to be feasible. You know, you don't want to claim that you're going to, you know, do all of this amazing field work and you're going to publish all these articles, and, you know, make it pragmatic in terms of what you're going to be able to accomplish while you're there. Again, keeping in mind, you know, the so-called deliverables or whatever they're going to want from you. For my postdoc at the Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell, I had to give them 2 papers. And this maybe goes back to what Jillian was saying, but don't give it all away. You know, don't give the article that could be this amazing world politics or international organization article to, you know, something that's going to be published by a center that you're doing your postdoc at. So figure out how you can kind of, you know, contribute some so that you've done a good job there, but that you're not giving away the whole candy store, as Mark likes to say. I love that expression. Speak with other postdocs in the application process. Dina Bashara mentioned this yesterday at our research and development group. You know, maybe at least look at the history of who's gotten that postdoc. What's the background? What kinds of research interests or sort of candidate interests are they looking for? And then once you're there, and I'll just sum this up really briefly, of course you want to try to turn the dissertation into the book if you have the time to do so. I really appreciate what Jillian said in terms of sometimes you need some space from the dissertation, so you're not just in defense mode. But, you know, if you've defended in January, I had defended in May, I started in the fall. You know, really trying to take the time to get your prospectus done. Hopefully you've gone to APSA, you've spoken with some publishers, take the time to do so. As I said, my second position was 6 new teaching preps at Barnard, and there was no way I would have gotten any progress on the book done, and I might have just, you know, let it drop. So having that time to invest in it, I think is really important. You could also think about this, depending on the opportunities, as sort of a platform for developing a course that you want to teach and getting that teaching experience on your CV. So my postdoc was, the first year was just research, the first term was research, the second term was teaching 1 course. And rather than like a visiting assistant professor where you're probably filling in courses that are already on the books, sometimes in these cases, they let you teach your own course. And so I developed a course on Turkey and the Middle East, and that was a great kind of experience in designing your own course, and B, getting something on the CV. You definitely want to take advantage of the research community around you. Be proactive. Don't expect that just because you're a postdoc there, everyone's going to come and knock on your door and visit you. You really need to take the time to be proactive and make those contacts. And it may be, for example, like I was housed in the International Studies Center, not the government department. So you have to make sure that you are kind of navigating the space that you're in and identifying. And, you know, those contacts are still incredibly valuable friends and colleagues for me. And it's just been a really good way to expand that. Spend a lot of time in your office. If you have hopefully an office on campus, be visible. You know, don't be the person who works from home or the coffee shop all the time. This is the opportunity again to make those contacts. And also, you know, participate in seminars and, you know, go and ask questions. And if you have the opportunity, present your work. You've probably done a couple of practice job talks at your own university before they let you out the door, but you probably had the opportunity to do that there as well. And it's a new community of people who are getting access to your work, but also can give you feedback that you probably haven't heard before. So all that is to say that I think a postdoc, it's definitely not just a fallback. I think it's a really useful opportunity to network, to develop the dissertation to the book while you still have the time before you're bombarded with administrative tasks and teaching tasks and all that, and to expand your contacts and your network. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Liesl. Liz is going to talk about navigating the job market.
Great, I actually made some slides, so I'm going to share my.
Overachiever, you.
No, I just, if I don't write it down right now.
This is how you navigate the job market. You have slides. Go for it, Liz. It could work. I don't know if you need special permissions.
Disabled participant screen sharing, so maybe this won't work.
Dang it.
Mark?
I'm looking at her right now. Her make co-host.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
Now you should be able to do it.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. So my name is Liz Nugent. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Yale University, and I was on the job market in the fall of 2016. And I'm hoping, building very much on what everyone has said here today. For those of you who are on the market now, this might not be as helpful, but I think, what I'd like you to come away with is that this is, and beyond that, the work that you do for the job market will be important for you as a junior professor and, as a scholar moving forward. So the first thing, this is kind of just the basics of what you might want to be doing 2 years out. It's hard to do the market, as I'll get to in just a little bit. It's extremely stressful. It's extremely time consuming. So making sure that you have finished your requirements, whether that's teaching or coursework, developing your dissertation project, and also conducting the work that you need to do for that dissertation project, not leaving big components for either after the market or a postdoc. You want to develop your portfolio, so applying for external grants, even if you're not successful, having to argue for why your dissertation is important and writing about it in kind of a condensed form is really important for thinking through future opportunities. And, speaking to some of what Jillian was talking about, you want to have your dissertation project and your own research, but I benefited tremendously from working on projects with senior scholars, my advisor, and other, more senior people, lots of POMEPS affiliated people. It's kind of a nice way to make sure that you have other research interests when you're looking for this big portfolio for tenure down the road. And you also learn a lot on somebody else's dime and with somebody else's responsibility kind of attached to it. So 1 to 2 years out, you really want to wrap up fieldwork so you can focus on writing. I found it very difficult to do writing while in the field. Having that literal physical distance and also, a comfortable place to write, a stable place to write was helpful for me. Over that year, you want to both finalize your dissertation committee and meet with them. Don't disappear. Part of the transition from a graduate student to a more senior scholar is figuring out how to take feedback and what feedback to take. So you want to make sure that you're getting that regular feedback. In line with that, you want to be going to conferences, workshops. POMEPS has quite a few great opportunities for getting feedback both from junior and senior scholars. You may want to form, a friendly writing group with your peers, other people in your cohort, to make sure that you're setting deadlines and getting to them. And a lot of writing the dissertation is throat clearing. So it's not just like you write. Thinking about how to do this over time, over the course of the 2 years before you go on the market is important. And then, as you're developing these articles now, during COVID, it's becoming even more delayed, but some articles that I've had published have taken 2 years from start to finish. And that's with, minimal much longer. So thinking through strategically when you need to have things under submission so they'll be out by the market is important. So the year out, you really want to be writing your dissertation advisor, your committee. You don't want to be a stranger to these people. You want to present as much as you can internally in your department where you will have a friendly group of people. But you also want to be presenting elsewhere where you're going to start to figure out, what are the major issues? What are the major questions that are going to come up? So when you hopefully get a job talk, it's not the first time you've heard these major critiques. And again, keep submitting articles. So on the market, this is the timeline that my experience followed. I know that things this year in particular are shifting back a bit. And there's always kind of a secondary market in the spring as well. So the summer before you go on the market, you're going to be spending a lot of time on your applications. I'll get to what that entails in just a minute. In the early fall, most of the applications are due. Most of the very competitive, as Liesl mentioned, postdoc applications are also due at this time. Some of the other postdocs will be due in the spring, but you're really going to spend August, September, October during a normal year, really just submitting these applications online. And you may want to invest in what is it called, Interfolio, where you can collect your materials and have them sent to the various applications. It just helps with streamlining the process. Ahead of time, because all of these things take a year, right? We apply for APSA next year, very soon. You want to plan to at least attend those conferences and hopefully present, organize a panel that benefits you with more senior scholars and peers. A lot of these conferences, they're important for networking, but they also will have some of these preliminary interviews. So, universities from abroad or universities with smaller travel budgets will try to maximize the conference and have, preliminary interviews to make sure that you're serious and might be a good fit for them. And then in the fall and the winter, interviews, job talks, if you're lucky, and more postdoc applications due, through March and April. So the job market materials are as follows. So you need a cover letter, teaching statement. If you've taught as a teaching assistant or your own course, you'll include either all the evaluations or kind of the highlights of your evaluations. A diversity statement about how you take diversity seriously in your own research and also in the classroom, a research statement, a writing sample, and 3 letters of recommendation. This is a little bit of different advice than what Mark gave, but when I was on the market, I was writing a book project dissertation. I submitted 3 chapters instead of a job market paper. For me, that made sense. The argument I was trying to make was, big enough, I hope, that it was going to be hard to smush into one paper. If you're writing a 3-paper dissertation, obviously, that's a little bit easier. But I think, if what you want to show is that you have a large idea that's a book manuscript, there's no harm in working on those chapters early and then submitting them, particularly if you have other articles, whether they're published or not, that you can send as a second writing sample. In terms of letters of recommendation, those will most likely come from your dissertation committee, and you should ask people early, and then there's no shame in following up. And one last comment on the application materials. Most of these things have a set form. You're not going to be doing any kind of creative writing in your cover letter or your teaching statement for the most part. So ask your senior if you can see their examples. And obviously you will have to write very different content, but there's kind of a standard form that these things take. You're not reinventing the wheel. In terms of the job talk, this is advice that I received from my advisor, and one that I pass on because I think it's helpful for structuring the job talk, but you will give your job talk more than just on the market. I'm giving a talk tomorrow on my book project, which is essentially my job talk. Over the past 3 years, I've kept giving, a version of the job talk about the project. So it's worth investing in this even before you get an interview. You want to make sure that if somebody calls you on a Monday and needs you there the next week, you're ready to go. So 35 minutes total. You're probably going to be interrupted depending on the norms of the department. Get through your introduction and motivation. In 5 minutes, you want to make sure that there's a question that somebody could recite back about what the main puzzle is, and then also what the answer is by those 5 minutes. 10 minutes for theory, 15 minutes for empirics, 5 minutes for a conclusion. This is a little bit more specific. Once, if you were lucky enough to get a talk, often this year it might be different. It might be on Zoom, and I've heard some weird stories about people like ordering takeout for the person and they eat together on Zoom. So I don't know how this will go, but normally these visits are 1 to 3 days. There's lots of one-on-one meetings between you and different administrators and other members of the faculty. One thing, a piece of advice that I got that I thought was very helpful was usually the night or 2 before, you will get a list of everyone who you're going to be meeting with, a schedule. I just printed out their CVs or their, the front introductory page of their website to try and figure out, like what do I have in common with this person? Where could I see us collaborating? Or what do I find interesting about their research? There'll be at least one dinner, which is always awkward because they want to ask you a number of questions while you're eating. You'll have the job talk, and then a teaching demonstration if you're going to a place that values teaching as part of the hiring process. And then finally, because I think I've already talked too long, My advice, having done this once, it was extremely stressful. I got no work done for about 6 months. I was very anxious. I self-medicated with too much sugar. So I would just advise, assume you're going to get very little work done. You don't partially go on the market. As Liesl mentioned, at this point, postdocs and assistant professor positions are just as competitive. So if you're going on the market, go fully on, apply to, the jobs that you would realistically want to work at. Stay off rumor boards. There's very little useful information there. And I think, particularly this year, thinking through all the possibilities of what you want to do with your PhD is important. There's a bit of a, process in graduate school where we're all more or less socialized to think, an assistant professor job is what I want. I know people that I went to graduate school who have very interesting and very fulfilling careers in the public sector, the private sector, think tanks, working for NGOs. There are lots of different ways to use your PhD and have a fulfilling career. So my advice has mostly spoken about the academic job market, but in the POMEPS world, in probably your institutional alumni networks, there's a lot of people who have done other things that are not academic.
Great, thank you, Liz. Let's unshare your screen so I can see the chat. All right, so we can take like 10 minutes or so for questions if people have any. Either put them in chat or raise your hand.
We answered everything.
We answered everything.
It was your PowerPoint. It was the slides that did it. Impressive, man.
That was I'm sorry, that was the best succinct discussion of the job market I've ever encountered. That was great, Liz.
That was great, Liz. Liz, how many jobs did you apply to? Liesl, how many jobs did you apply to?
I applied.
Oh, go ahead, Liz.
I think I applied to 20.
I would say my first year out when I was still finishing my dissertation, I think I applied to probably 40. And yeah, I would say 30 to 40 each time. Yeah. But it is, I think you shouldn't underestimate, whether it's for a postdoc or a tenure track position, you shouldn't underestimate the amount of time it's going to take and the emotional, baggage that you're carrying with you and the stress that's involved. And definitely staying off the rumor boards, I think is good advice. Again, do as I say, not as I do, but also know that not only do you not get good information there, but there are people there that are deliberately disseminating disinformation to mess with you. So it's a pernicious environment.
The rumor boards are toxic. One piece of advice that I would give from the other side of the equation, and this is not about Liesl, who was a model graduate student, but the interfolio thing is actually extremely useful because you can drive your advisor crazy if you ask them 40 times for 40 individual letters. Ideally, with interfolio, your advisor will write a letter and it'll go up in interfolio. There might be some jobs that are a little bit different, like in Liesl's case, most of them were Middle East jobs, but some of them were European. So she had 2 letters that I wrote. One of them was oriented towards showing that she could do Europe, and the other one was showing that she was truly a Middle East person. But your advisor, who probably has 5 or 10 grad students on the market, doesn't want to be approached 30 or 40 times for 30 or 40 different letters. But when it's necessary, do it. Right? So, if you are applying for a job in a different department, like this is a sociology position I think I'm really good for, or it's a women's studies position that I'm really good for, your advisor is going to want to know that because they want you to get a job. And so basically, it's like a 2-track thing. If there's a standard generic, just have that in interfolio, have it sent out. But if there's something that could be tailored and that it's important that it be tailored, go ahead and ask for it. So kind of like split that balance there. Let's see. Amna wanted to know, how do you navigate field work when you have to also be on the job market?
I mean, so I had a little bit more field work to do for my dissertation, and I scheduled it after kind of the bulk of when I anticipated the jobs would be, and I didn't book it until I knew that I wasn't going to have any more interviews. I think, if you are looking at jobs in the US, you probably want to be staying in the US at least through the fall. And again, I don't know if that's relevant this year. A lot of this is going to be either online or maybe delayed. So I think for the most part, you don't want to be doing new research while you're on the market.
Matthew asked a question about combining academic jobs with a look at non-academic positions. Let's defer that question because Sean will be talking about that in the third panel. Nathaniel asks advice for people who may not get a postdoc and have to go directly into a teaching position, tenure track or non-tenure track. It's a tough one. You're going to be working super, super hard. I've both been in that position quite recently. So maybe you could give advice on that.
I think it's definitely going to depend on the extent to which you can choose the courses that you're teaching, and B, choose the content of the courses. But one of the things that I try to do is basically incorporate the stuff that I'm working on in the courses that I'm teaching, or I really try and tailor it or focus it towards that. So the syllabi that I'm teaching is the stuff I should be reading right now for the work that I'm doing. So trying to combine the two, I think is the best advice that I can get. Kind of give build into your syllabus the stuff that you need to be working on and engaging, because even if it's not something that necessarily ends up in your work, the intellectual exercise of engaging with it and engaging students with it and the questions that they ask, I think can be really useful. And it may be, you never know how these things aggregate or how they play out, but getting you to think about things from different perspectives in the teaching environment that may come up in a job talk that you hadn't necessarily thought of, because there's only so many practice job talks that you can do. So any way that you can try to combine that is ideal. But as Mark said, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time.
One piece of advice that I got too about your first year teaching is just expect you're not going to get anything done the first fall. It's a lot of work. And so if your expectation is that nothing's going to get done, then anything you get done feels really good. But the fall of your first teaching position, when you're teaching your first course most of the time all by yourself, it's a lot. And expectations can help defer some of that anxiety.
I want to add one thing, which is that many departments, like good departments, will typically do what they can to protect junior faculty, especially new junior faculty, from overly burdensome service requirements, service obligations, and they'll try and give them kind of duplicate teaching, so maybe multiple sections of an intro course, but there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case, and many departments are not like that. And that's one thing to think about. I think this is particularly a problem for women and for minorities. They'll be asked to serve on lots of committees because they want to, for diversity reasons, and it's okay to say no. You can't say no to everything, but you don't have to say yes to everything. If they want to put you on the curriculum committee, and that's going to be a huge, curricular review process, and you're in your second year, and there is space to say no. Talk to your department chair, talk to your faculty mentor, and kind of focus on what is really important to you at that stage of your career, which is teaching and getting published. And so then there's other issues like that will come up early in your career.
If I could just super quick on that, it may also be the case that, depends on how much leeway you have, but you may be able to negotiate a course release. Yes. When you are offered a contract, don't be afraid to, and Mark is great about this, telling his women students, ask for more, right? Ask for a course release, ask for a higher salary. Don't be afraid that they're going to pull the offer from you. I don't think I've ever heard of that being the case. And if they did, I'm sure that it was an egregious ask, but negotiating course release can be really beneficial because exactly as Liz said, you're adjusting maybe to a new city. So a new schedule, new students, new administration, figuring out how Blackboard works there, right? All the different things that course release in your first term or your first year, that's ideal if you can negotiate it in.
Basil asked about jumping from contract or adjunct positions to tenure track. It can be done. It gets harder every year that you're out and you're competing with like the fresh new dissertation, the fresh new PhDs. And the best advice that I would give on that is publish and publish and publish, because no matter how good your teaching is or how much service you do, no one's going to care outside of that institution, really. And so if you can maintain an active publication record while you're doing contract adjunct work, you'll keep yourself at least hopefully competitive on the tenure track market. Yeah, but that's a very tough one. And I think the last question, Rana asking kind of how hiring has been affected. What does the job market realistically look like right now? I know has a hiring freeze. I saw on Twitter the other day. By the way, avoid Twitter. But I saw on Twitter the other day that there were only like 45 jobs in political science, tenure track jobs this year. Maybe that was just in American politics or something. But at any rate, it's there's not a lot of hiring going on this year, and it's actually pretty frightening.
I would say I think certain places that have hiring freezes right now, there's a lot of negotiations going on about like getting some of those things unfrozen. So it's normally by now there would be way more jobs posted. I think there's going to be more things coming up in like October. So I don't know. I mean, it's not a great year, but I think there will be more opportunities perhaps later than we would normally anticipate.
And one thing I would add to that is that, like as with this workshop we're doing right now, the shift to online everything has obviously not been, super optimal, but it does enable some things that weren't previously possible. So we're able to do at POMEPS, we do a virtual workshop, and we were able to be far more open to scholars coming from the Middle East or far away that would have been prohibitively expensive to fly them in the past. And I think that something similar might happen with some job searches where the costs of running a search are significantly lower when you don't have to fly candidates in. So, I mean, it could recover, but and so much as with everything, it depends on what happens with the economy and COVID and everything else. All right, great. Well, thank you, Liesl and Liz. Let's move to our final panel, Sean and May, talking about the non-American market and the non-academic tracks.
Thank you, Mark. I also have some slides to share to just.
Perfect. Let me make you a co-host as well. We're gonna have so many co-hosts we can. There we go. You should be able to do it now.
All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Mark and Ahmed, for organizing this. And let me start just by introducing myself very quickly and where I came from and why I was asked to do this presentation. So I did my PhD in Edinburgh in the UK, and then I moved to research position at the GIGA in Hamburg in Germany. And then I had my first lectureship at Durham University, where I stayed for 4 years. And just this year, I moved to the University of Birmingham in the UK. And basically, my presentation the different types of universities in the UK, how to navigate, but also how to read the job market and a little bit of insight on what's happening there at the moment. So to start with, first of all, the UK universities are very diverse, and just bear with me. If you bear with me with these kind of typologies, you would know why I'm introducing this when I start applications. But we have basically 4 types of universities in the UK: the ancient universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, Edinburgh, and then what's called the red brick university. And then we have the plate glass universities that were established in the post-1960s, and then the post-1992. Or research universities, especially the 2 first or the 3 first types of universities. But the rest, you'll also find many universities in the UK which are teaching focused. And to just kind of be sure about what kind of university you're looking at, They use what we call the Russell Group University, which is a list of 24 universities in the UK, which allocate a lot of time and money for research. So universities, you would expect that you will be allocated research time in your workload. Research will be appreciated. You will be asked to do research, publish, to get promoted, and so on. But if you apply for any of universities which are teaching focused, you shouldn't expect any of that. So what kind of jobs to look at, or the titles of jobs? So first, there are postdoctoral fellowships, mainly like the equivalent to what Liesel was talking about. And mainly these are very, very few in the UK. So you would only find Oxford and Cambridge, which are advertising some of these fellowships. But most of the fellowships, the postdoc fellowships, are through Research Council funding, either the Leverhulme or the British Academy or the ESRC. And what happens is that you apply, but at the same time, you would have to get the approval through the university. And if you get the grant, the university will be contributing to some of these funds. These are very, very prestigious, but the only thing about these grants that you're totally independent. You're part of the university, but at the same time, you're not really asked to teach, you're not really asked to do any admin. And the good news is that these fellowships are still ongoing this year during the COVID. So the British Academy have just announced their early career fellowships, the same thing for the Leverhulme. So none of this is going to stop the next few years. And luckily, they are not going to be affected by Brexit either. The only thing that it's becoming more and more competitive every year. The other thing that's becoming more and more part of the UK outlook in academia is what we call the teaching fellowships, which are teaching focused positions, fixed term contracts for 1 or 2 years, and somehow they're very exploitative and abusive in many ways. So if you're applying for any of these, you should expect to not be able to do any research. But many people take this as a first step to get in academia, and then after a year or two, they apply for lectureship, but don't expect to get any research time. Nominally, you're allocated 20% of your time for research, but this does not really happen. And then you have lectureships, which are the assistant professor jobs. What has been introduced in the UK the last few years is an assistant professor, but a teaching track academic career. And somehow this is kind of giving another option for people who are more interested in teaching and less publishing. Not all of the universities have this track, but they have been increasing year after year. There are so many problems with it, but if you see a teaching focused assistant professor, you should know that this is a 20% research and 80% teaching. The situation with COVID that most of the lectureships at the moment are now frozen, but they are not going to be frozen forever. If you're a bit familiar with the UK system, we have the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework. The cycle will end this year, but after this year, the university will start worrying again about the next REF cycle. So they will go back hiring new people, getting new publications, and so on. The postdoc fellowships, they are announced and they will be open as well this year. The teaching fellowships, they have not been announced, but nevertheless, I can tell you from my institution and from the other institutions that I'm familiar with, what has been happening so far is that the universities have stopped every sort of hiring until they know how many students will actually arrive at the end of September. So by the end of September, they will be able to know how much teaching they will need, how many more staff they will need to be hiring. So I would expect throughout the fall, October, and fellowships coming on if the situation has not changed, if the international students have not been sort of applying elsewhere. But if we have the same numbers in the UK universities and the applications are much higher actually this year, but we still don't know whether the student will arrive. Most of the people actually expect over the fall, they will open positions for teaching. They're not going to be opening any lectureships this year, probably not the year after either, but there will be more and more teaching fellowships because the university does not want to commit long-term contracts at the moment. If you're looking in the UK market, you will find that somehow, even though the language is English, but the norms and the culture are very, very different from the American system. Even the way writing the application, even the way writing the cover letter is very, very different. So you want to familiarize yourself with that. You have to tailor your application. Don't use the same application you're using to apply for a US university and just assume that they will be able to read it. No, they're not gonna like it. So make sure you do your homework, make sure that you get everything right on the application. One of the things for the UK is the cover letter. Not many material is necessary for the application. It's usually the cover letter and the CV, and make sure you have a very strong cover letter. And the cover letter is not really about everything you've done, but it's rather about how you respond to the job ad and how your achievements make you the perfect candidate for that job. So every ad is actually put for a reason. And somehow I've been on almost 6 search committees in the last few years. And the way we do the shortlisting is we actually look at the cover letter and we see whether every single requirement, either essential or desired, has been mentioned or addressed in the cover letter. And based on that point, you either get shortlisted or you don't get shortlisted. So you really have to read the ad very, very carefully. Make sure you familiarize yourself with the UK system, the REF, the TEF. We also have the Teaching Excellence Framework. We also care a lot about teaching innovation. If you don't mention teaching innovation in your cover letter, I'm sorry, you're not going to be invited for an interview. In your teaching, how do you address that? More importantly, if you're not familiar with some of the terms, familiarize yourself. Don't use course. We don't use courses. We actually use modules to talk about our. We also use term, not semester. It's just very small things, but it shows how much effort and how much preparation you've put in the material when you're applying for a job. Finally, when it comes to several of these jobs that I've been talking about, the teaching fellow, the postdoc, or the lectureship, sadly, it's all about publications. Even if you have a very long experience of teaching and you're applying for a teaching job, if you don't have the publications, you're not. As simple as that, and it's very sad. The job market is very saturated, and it's just about whoever has more and whoever can prove that they have more and do more. So let's say, be vigilant. Do not apply for a lectureship if you don't have a publication. You're just wasting your time. Don't apply for a postdoc if you don't have a proposal, and definitely do not apply for a teaching fellowship if you don't think that you don't want to teach the topics and the themes that basically are put in the ad. So make sure you read the ad. Don't just apply for everything. Really apply and take the time and spend time writing these applications, because in the end, for every job, I can tell you for a lectureship, we receive sometimes over 150 applications. Shortlist between 7 and 10 people. So somehow, if your application does not stand out, if you're not really addressing what's requested in the job ad, your application is not going to make it. The interview in the UK is a little bit different than in the US. You're only allowed usually 15 to 20 minutes to present about everything: research, teaching, and admin. And I can talk about this if it comes up in the question or if there's anyone interested in that, but it is usually the norm, and it's usually about how you present what you're doing fits in the department that you're applying for. If you're applying for a teaching position, you will be asked to do a lecture. It might be 20 minutes or 40 minutes, depending. And then you will have a 30 to 40-minute interview with a panel, head of department, someone from the faculty or college, someone from HR, and probably 1 or 2 other senior academics in the department. You cannot go in the interview without doing your research about the department. I've seen so many excellent candidates who have publications, have teaching experience, they have everything. Their application on paper looks excellent, and then they turn up to the interview, they haven't done their research about the department they're applying for. And somehow this just kills the whole process, because it simply shows they haven't done the effort. They're not interested in who they're going to be working with. So make sure you do your homework, make sure you do your research, make sure future colleagues, because if you're not interested in what they're doing, they won't be interested. Finally, when it comes to the job market in Europe, it's a little bit different than in the UK. I think it was yesterday, Liesel was talking about somehow in the US, 1 or 2 postdocs is okay, more than that, it's not okay. Europe, it's actually the opposite. I know people who've done 4 or 5 postdocs. It's just how the job market is. In Germany, for example, everything between a PhD and a professorship is a postdoc. So somehow you also have to familiarize yourself with every country. Every country has a different system, a different language in the application. Many universities in Europe, they usually start with a 3-year contract and then 5 years and maybe a permanent contract. Make sure you understand exactly the system when you're applying. One thing about Europe, there are much more postdocs than in the UK. There's so much more opportunities for funding. The Research Council in every European, but there's also the European Research Council. So many people start by funding their own job, their own postdocs by getting the grant and then having the grant paid their own salary and being affiliated with a university or a research institute. So this might be another option if you want more sort of freedom, more leeway, and if you have a very strong proposal that you could actually generate funding through that proposal. I'm just gonna stop here. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward for any questions.
Great, thank you, May. Sean, why don't you go next, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay. Let me get my slideshow. I'm just kidding. No slides. Yeah, no slides. I will just say, as a point of observation, because I know that many of our participants are probably thinking this now, and I can relate, about uncertainties on the job market, on the academic job market, because of the overall state of the global economy, particularly of the European and American economies. What I can tell you from experience is that dips are always followed by the normalization of the hiring curve. So I finished my PhD in May 2009, which meant I was on the job market fall 2008. That's when everything collapsed. So I remember that was a cataclysmic experience. Not only were endowments collapsing, but public universities were contracting. I had 2 job offers which were offered to me and then pulled, even under contract, by universities whose deans and provosts told them that hiring was frozen after the job talks had taken place and offers were extended. And what I discovered, that was a pretty bad dip in the economy. And it took a year or 2 for things to recover, but they did recover. So if there's a silver lining on the cloud of what's happening now, it's that, yes, many universities have hiring freezes. And yes, this may not be the best year to apply, but future years will be better. And so I'll always take away the positive from that. So what I would like to talk very briefly about is the broad realm of what we call consulting and non-academic publishing, which means a lot of things. What I would define this as are essentially opportunities to conduct research, analysis, writing, and work for organizations and projects outside the traditional academic system. And it comes in a variety of forms. The lightest form, for instance, would include the writing you may do for a non-academic journal or an outlet, sometimes on commission, that are aimed at non-academic audiences while you are a traditional academic. A lot of these outlets are online, some are in print. So that's something that many academics can relate to because that's, these opportunities come up frequently. The kind of heaviest form of this sector is essentially when you leave academia and you seek jobs outside the university sector. So that means seeking employment at profit-seeking enterprises, think tanks, government institutions, NGOs, academic publishers, or an entirely different sector. I'm not going to focus on that mainly because we as academics are probably not the best experts at getting non-academic jobs. But in general, the emphasis outside academia falls upon, in my experience, whether you possess the appropriate background knowledge, the optimal skill set, and most of all, a good fit with the team that you'll be working on. What I want to focus on, in terms of consulting and non-academic publishing is something that I think would be most useful for a lot of people, which is something in between those two light and heavy forms, which is substantive work that you do while serving as an academic at a university or a college, as an instructor, as a postdoc, or as a tenure-track faculty member. And I think that some of the insights I want to raise are applicable to the other tracks, particularly seeking employment outside academia. So I hope they're useful. So when we talk about consulting and non-academic opportunities for academic scholars, we typically mean one of, I'd say, about 6 things. One is work that you can do for government-related institutions like foreign affairs ministries, diplomatic missions, foreign aid teams, intelligence directorates, and public outreach. The second is work that you can do for advocacy NGOs, like refugee and humanitarian organizations, many of us are familiar with. A third is work you can do for research-based foundations like think tanks, human rights groups, development assistance networks, and democracy monitors like Freedom House and Human Rights Watch. The fourth is work you can do for law firms, whose clients may include refugees, asylum seekers, private actors, and commercial firms that are struggling with the legal systems of certain MENA countries, and those law firms need an expert witness or a researcher who can do a particular job for them. The fifth includes work you can do for multilateral institutions and organizations like the World Bank, the World Health Organization, even the United Nations. And the sixth includes work that you can do for explicit profit-seeking enterprises like energy companies and political risk firms, both of which, as you can imagine, do a lot of business in the Middle East. What I've discovered is that, what many of us can relate to as well, is that these opportunities are often highly networked, and they can present themselves through word of mouth, or simply when the principals at these institutions read your published work, or more often, they just do basic internet searches and they look at the names that come up in the first 50 results on Google. And this is where sometimes publishing outside academia comes in handy, because it raises your profiles in ways that a peer-reviewed journal hidden behind a paywall simply does not. Another opportunities that you can do, whether it's for NGOs or governments or law firms or multilateral institutions or profit-seeking enterprises, do come with compensation. I mean, usually it's some kind of financial compensation, but other times the compensation is more intangible but valuable. It includes opportunities to produce reports or contribute data or analyses to bigger projects that aim to have a palpable impact in the region. And sometimes the projects can put you in direct touch with policymakers and advocates and individuals with considerable influence, individuals who can later become useful as subjects for your academic research, or just as connectors to people on the ground in these countries or in other sectors that can help you collect data. What I want to say about all these kinds of different works and projects is that what distinguishes them is that they're contract-based. And like all contract-based work, it's a good thing to it's good to keep 3 things in mind, because you are an academic entering into a non-academic arena. The first thing to keep in mind, you have to think very carefully about the moral and ethical implications of doing this kind of work, because you're contributing to institutions and organizations over which you have, even in cases, so that moral hazard is easy to think about if, say, a foreign affairs ministry, for instance, or an intelligence service comes to you and says, would you consult for us for implications of that? But even in cases where it seems that there are good intentions, like humanitarian NGOs working with refugees, or legal cases involving somebody escaping human rights abuses, there are often multiple hidden interests embedded into every project. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So whereas in academic publishing and research, you hold the game, You initiate the project, you select the problem, you choose your methods, you collect the data, you publish the results. When you step into consulting and non-academic work, you may have little control over any or all of these stages. And that brings about some important consequences that may be different for, that may impact people differently. The second thing to keep in mind about this contract-based work is that this work is often protected by pretty ironclad confidentiality agreements. And so what you'll often find is that you can write a really good paper for a think tank or an NGO or a government or a private client, and it may not be published or disseminated very well in academia or even at all. And partly for this reason, and partly because the academic sector remains pretty heavily biased against this kind of work, oftentimes very little consulting or non-academic work you do counts for your tenure and promotion within the traditional university-based ecosystem. And so my personal advice is that if you want to remain in academia and ascend those ranks of getting your ideal academic position at a college or university or higher educational institution in the tertiary sector, and you're facing a tenure clock, you should never do this kind of consulting work if it interferes with or undermines your primary research agenda. Oftentimes, it can be simply a marginal benefit that comes with becoming more visible as a public scholar. And sometimes the work that you do, I mean, the financial compensation can come in handy, and sometimes it will put you in touch with a big network of contacts that can really be helpful. But again, you know, your tenure in college institutions do not care about this kind of work as much as they care about your publications and about the traditional metrics of ascension within that ecosystem. The third and final thing to keep in mind about contract-based work is that even if you're satisfied with the ethical risk of doing that kind of work and the tangible rewards and the opportunity cost of participating, it's always a good idea to think about your personal value in this. And by value, I mean that in a very material capitalist sense. Think about the following two questions. What is your working hourly rate or project cost? Sometimes you may be asked by an NGO or a consulting firm to simply write a paper or to consult on a project, and they'll say, this job is for a set amount of compensation. We'll pay you X amount if you do the work for us, and that's fine. Other times you'll be asked to present an invoice or billing statement, and that billing statement will typically require you to log hours and generate an hourly rate for yourself in order for your principal to provide compensation. And that's an important question to ask if this opportunity ever comes up. What is the literal financial worth that you offer to these institutions if you work on an hourly rate? Is it $50 an hour? Is it $500 an hour? Is it something in between? But that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that these organizations outside academia take deadlines very seriously. So in that sense, they are the opposite of academia. We as academics are terrible evaluators of our time resources and our schedules. Publishers are notoriously generous, for instance, with late book projects and so forth, and that's fine, and that's a luxury that we have. Based on a contract and a deadline, larger organizations will be very displeased if you don't meet your obligations to meet that deadline. The deadlines in this sector are taken very, very seriously, unlike academia. And that's just another thing to keep in mind. So I guess to summate, I would just say that, you know, this kind of consulting or non-academic work that you can do, it's not going to be a primary interest for a lot of people. And for many cases, it's simply going to be a marginal benefit that comes up as you gain visibility. But if these opportunities ever do come up and you gain and you have access to these institutions and you're able to do this kind of work, the rewards that come from that work can be quite tangible, and they can potentially enrich your own understanding of the region. They do come with heavy moral hazards at times, and this kind of work should never take precedence over your own individual academic agenda, the agenda that your own institutions will take seriously. But on a personal level, it can do wonders to just broaden the scope of your own understanding of the countries of your interest and even the sectors that you work with. Some of the work that I've done for clients in the past have put me in touch with sources of data that just I would almost kill to just get out of these confidentiality agreements and publish about them, because these are sometimes individuals or data sources or knowledge about events and things that cut straight to the heart of critical puzzles that we wrestle with in our subfield, but because they're not academic and because they're protected by different constraints, you know, but at the same time, they enrich our own understanding of how politics works, how governments operate, how people mobilize, how economies actually operate behind the scenes, who's pulling the strings, how development actually exists on the ground, what conditions are like for human populations and refugees and so forth. These are oftentimes lucrative opportunities that you can get to know more about these questions if they come up, because they don't always come up, and if you can satisfy those moral questions, and if it does not interfere with your own individual research and your academic agenda.
Awesome, thank you, Sean. So we have about 10 minutes if people would like to put some questions up in the chat. Or if there are no questions, then
did we ever get to Matthew's question about
yes,
kind of how to balance academic and non-academic? I know consulting seems to be something that maybe comes to you more than you seek it out, but maybe folks have ideas about how to be looking at both markets.
My sense on the non-academic jobs, I think one thing that Sean said, which I think is just dead right and really important, is how important the networking part of it is. Many of the people who I've seen go from kind of PhD program into like a real world job with Facebook or, you know, tech startups or that sort of thing, it happens through personal connections, that sort of, and things like that. Which isn't a very useful answer, perhaps, because other than have personal connections, I'm not sure what to do with that. But I do think that like those are entirely different worlds, and if you want to get into that world, you kind of have to get into that world, if that makes sense. I think that I think there is kind of a snobbery about it in many PhD programs and many departments that basically kind of look down on the very possibility of doing that sort of thing. And so getting out of that mentality is often important. This is not like I am going to, you know, I'm going to slum and go and like grace the private sector with my brilliance, because that's really quite the opposite of what's going to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that the job market materials you develop for academia, for all but maybe a few opportunities outside academia, those are not very useful. I mean, cover letters are not, you know, 2.5 pages long, single spaced. For instance, when you apply to a consulting firm or even the World Bank or an advocacy NGO, there is a very heavy emphasis on skill set and the fit with the team, because a lot of these organizations, even NGOs, not just profit-seeking enterprises like political risk firms, you know, they run on grants or budgets that require deliverables and deadlines, and they need to produce on a constant schedule. And so what they're looking for is not someone who can expound upon the sophisticated, you know, intellectual nuances of a particular topic, which is valuable in and of itself, but whether if they slot you in to a productive team, could you, for instance, consistently churn out strategic insight on this question? Could you produce papers on this question? Could you come in handy and travel to this work site and provide input on that particular project? And they need to know that well before they call you in for a first or second or third round interview. And so to know that, they don't want to wade through your job market materials. They might not even read any part of your dissertation, for instance. They just want to know, what did you learn from your dissertation in a paragraph, which is kind of disconcerting, but it's a completely parallel job sector, I found.
I didn't see Matthew's question, but in terms of kind of balancing the academic and the non-academic, one thing that I've actually faced is my tenure committee saying 2 years in a row, you know, make sure you're not focusing too much on the non-academic stuff that you're doing. One of the ways that, and make sure that the research and the publications is balancing that. But what I found is that as long as the publications are forthcoming, the networks, and this is kind of getting to what Sean was talking about, for interviews and for data outside of confidentiality agreements, has really made the work that I've done, you know, in the think tank world and the government policy world useful. And so it's not just about the time that you're spending writing those policy reports or appearing on those panels. It's about the relationships that you're developing that you can then leverage further when you are doing research as well. One thing that I wanted to add on to what Sean was saying that I think is really important in terms of consulting is tend to contact you, but make sure that you don't give free labor. You know, I've gotten on the phone sometimes, and what I think is going to be a 2 or 3 minute conversation turns into an hour-long conversation about the state of the opposition in Turkey. And I mean, I don't do that anymore. I've realized what's happening, but you know, they're not journalists, right? They're profiting from what they're doing, and they would pay a consultant a lot more. So it was just, you know, learn from my mistakes at the first couple of times that I got talked into conversations that, you know, they're basically taking that information and then they're able to sell that to their client. So make sure that you're kind of being responsible for your own worth in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And Aida had a question about does it matter whether I do my postdoc studies in a different region from where you apply for the job. Liesl might have a different answer. I wouldn't think that it would, as long as you're able to use that postdoc to publish.
Sorry, what was the question? If you do the postdoc in a region, like you're local.
Would it matter where I do my postdoc studies when I apply for a job in a different region?
Oh, okay. So that's a good question. So like one way that I would interpret that might be, if I'm looking to get a tenure track job in the US, does it matter if I take a European postdoc or something
Exactly.
like that? That's a really good question. I think it depends on the prestige of the university. One of the things that I've noticed is that it's extremely difficult for people who've done their PhD at, say, a European university to get a tenure track job in the US. There's unfortunately just beliefs about, you know, methodologies and what you cover and so forth. And obviously the PhD process is different, say in the UK, where you don't have the coursework and so forth. But postdocs, I haven't necessarily seen that as counting as a negative. I've been on one search committee, and I don't remember any sort of, you know, viewing of that as a negative. So I appreciate that May pointed to the postdocs kind of signaling different things in the European and American markets. I think that's really important. So what I had said yesterday is I've been on a search committee where, you know, if someone's had 3 postdocs, people are wondering, well, you know, are they hireable, or, you know, why haven't other committees looked at this? And one of the things that unfortunately we have to remember is, you know, search committees we use cognitive shortcuts, and we use heuristics, and we use signals, and sometimes we're not necessarily, you know, looking for the right things in terms of all the detail. And so if someone is just, you know, going through, okay, CV, 3 postdocs, maybe, you know, they're not taking the time to dive into that file as much as they should. So thinking about what you're signaling to particular markets, I think, is really important. But I don't think doing like a postdoc at LSE or something like that is going to negatively affect your chances on the US job market. I do think the PhD training does, and I've seen a lot of evidence of that, unfortunately, but I don't think the postdoc does.
Well, I want to thank, we're pretty much out of time here. So I really do want to thank all the panelists and all the participants for being a part of this. We hope that this was helpful. Of course, this is part of an ongoing initiative with POMEPS, with the APSA-MENA section, and with the APSA workshop, the MENA workshops, to try and institutionalize this and make these opportunities as available as possible for scholars, and hopefully to bring you all into the appropriate networks and to maximize your opportunities. So thank you very, very much. Ahmed, did you want to have any final words?
No, thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward, and I think hopefully when this session is ready to be uploaded, whether on the POMEPS website or the APSA-MENA section, there will be another opportunity for others who also were not able to join. So I think that could be another good opportunity.
Absolutely. All right, well, be well, everybody. Enjoy your APSA conference, and I hope to hear from all of you at some point in the future. Take care.